Hello, everybody. My name is Susie Fitton and I work for Inclusion Scotland. We're a disabled people's organisation, or DPO for short. We work to achieve positive changes to policy and practice for disabled people across Scotland. I'm going to talk today about why accessible housing is important to disabled people. When you get any large group of disabled people together to talk about housing issues, you will hear quotes like this one. This comes from a woman called Irene Patterson, who waited almost 15 years for a house that met her needs. And I spoke with her at an engagement event I ran with Capability Scotland and Housing Options Scotland in 2015. And Irene said the following. She said, "Without an accessible house that meets our needs, many older and disabled people get stuck in parts of our own home, stuck in hospital, in residential care, in the childhood home living with aging parents, or on a waiting list for the right house that is never built. We find ourselves living in places we don't want to be. We miss out on everything you can think of: social life, employment, getting the care and support we need, being active citizens and part of our communities. We can't settle, but we can't move on or live as full citizens. For some of us, it's about level access or having enough space to get into every room when using a wheelchair or mobility aid, or being able to find and afford an accessible house to buy or rent. For others, it can be about a spare room for storing equipment or a sensory room, being close to family and support networks, or feeling safe or having the right adaptations. All of these adjustments are reasonable, but so often it's a fight to get them, or they happen by chance and only after years of fighting, and not everyone's got the energy or the right support to fight. As disabled people, we have a right to accessible and adequate housing under the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, the UNCRPD, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the Human Rights Act. Yet, because of a chronic shortage of accessible and adapted housing across tenure in Scotland, disabled people continue to tell us that finding a house in Scotland that meets their needs can be fraught with difficulty. The recent year-long statutory inquiry by the Equality and Human Rights Commission into accessible and adapted housing for disabled people highlighted what disabled people have been telling us and other disabled people's organisations for over 20 years. The inquiry found that disabled people are demoralised and frustrated by the housing system due to a severe shortage of accessible and adapted houses across all tenures. Installing home adaptations involved unacceptable bureaucracy and delay, and disabled people were not getting the support that they need to live independently. From the advice and casework that I've done over the years and from numerous engagement events that I've been involved in, I know that disabled people across Scotland are still experiencing injury or ill health directly as a result of being inaccessibly housed, can wait years for a suitable house. They can be stuck in hospital as a delayed discharge, in residential care against their will, or be inappropriately discharged into an inaccessible home. They can find it impossible to find an accessible home to buy, and they face problems getting an adaptation. Disabled people continue to tell us that they can be forced to use incontinence products or receive extra personal care because they cannot access their own bathroom. They can be denied a social care package or be forced to use a care and support package to enable them to access parts of their home. We've heard stories of people being washed at the local leisure centre, or disabled children being washed at school or at the kitchen sink, having to be carried into their own home or garden because they can't access the front and or the back doors, unable to leave the parental home to start an independent life, having to be cooked for or eat convenience foods. They may experience loneliness and social isolation because they can't leave their home or visit other people's homes, or be unable to take up job offers because they cannot find accessible accommodation within a suitable distance. Now, this has much wider impact than just the individual impact on somebody's life. The wider impacts of having a shortage of accessible homes include that social care budgets can be pressurised by increased home care costs, as disabled people require assistance with bathing or washing, which they cannot do due to a lack of accessible bathroom and toilet facilities or a lack of adaptations. Poor housing also has a negative impact on physical and mental health, which contributes to greater demand on NHS and social care budgets. And disabled people living in inaccessible houses are also 4 times less likely to be in employment. This has implications for tax revenue and social security budgets. So what is the scale of the problem? The 2017 Scottish House Condition Survey told us that 62,000 households in Scotland who required an adaptation for a disabled person didn't have one. 61,000 households that included a disabled person who couldn't get up or down the stairs inside their own home. 34,000 households found it difficult or impossible to access their bath or shower. 11,000 couldn't get around the house because of the design layout. 9,000 found it difficult to access their own toilet, and 8,000 households included a disabled person who couldn't leave the house because of stairs to the house. There is a particularly acute need when it comes to wheelchair accessible homes. Still minding the step, a new estimation of housing need among wheelchair users in Scotland by Horizon Housing Association showed that over 17,000 wheelchair users were living in unsuitable homes across Scotland, and that this unmet need was set to increase by 80% by 2024 because of current health trends that predict an increase in the use of wheelchairs. So in 6 years, we may see over 31,000 households that include a wheelchair user living in unsuitable homes. The scale of the challenge is significant. We're simply not building enough wheelchair accessible homes. Between 2008 and 2016, 132,994 new homes were built in Scotland, yet only 1,427 were built to wheelchair accessible standards. At current rates of build, it will take us 95 years to meet the current unmet needs of wheelchair users and 174 years to meet their projected needs. So why is this not a national scandal? You do see the occasional story in the press of a disabled person trapped in a third floor flat or having to be carried in through a window, but by and large, many of the impacts of a shortage of accessible housing take place behind closed doors. It's not like rough sleeping that is particularly visible to the public. It goes on behind net curtains. It goes on behind closed doors, and these issues are therefore invisible to society. We're told accessible housing may be a generational issue, and we see long-term strategies and forward looks when what we need is urgent action. Which raises the question of how we get people to engage with this as an issue. How do we get it on everyone's agenda? I think the current context is particularly important here. We know from history that major shocks, war, an economic crash, or indeed a pandemic, can provide societies with an opportunity for real change. In the context of COVID-19, everybody has had a taste of what it's like to be disabled and to have your life restricted and limited by social barriers. The home has become a locus for many people's work lives, caring responsibilities, family lives, and social lives. We think at Inclusion Scotland that this is an ideal time to emphasise the critical importance of accessible homes that meet the needs of older and disabled people. So what are the opportunities? What are the policy levers that are coming up, and what needs to happen? I'll finish with a quick shopping list of what we think is achievable at the moment. The Social Renewal Advisory Board, which is advising the Scottish Government on how we should emerge from the pandemic in policy terms, is now advocating for a right to adequate and accessible housing to be incorporated into Scots law. We would agree that disabled people need a justiciable right to accessible and adequate housing. So we think that we need to incorporate a right to adequate and accessible housing in Scots law. We think that there is also a groundswell of support for the creation of a new cross-tenure design and space standard for all new homes that takes account of developments in inclusive design, design for dementia and autism, as well as for disabled people using larger wheelchairs and those with bariatric needs. We now have guidance to local authorities to set local targets for the provision of wheelchair accessible homes. We think we need to monitor progress following this guidance and actually achieve an increase in supply in wheelchair accessible housing across tenure, so not just for social rent, but also for private sale. We need to create a well-funded and tenure-neutral system for timely, person-centred adaptations. The key message from me and the thing that I'd like you to kind of take away from this presentation is that we need 3 interlocking systems to be functioning properly to actually address the issue of accessible housing in Scotland. So we need, firstly, an adequate new supply of accessible homes. We need effective allocations practice for adapted social rented housing, and we need timely and person-centred adaptations. Now, failure in one part of these systems puts enormous strain on the other parts. In each of these policy areas, there is some good policy practice and strategy in Scotland, but despite national and local work to improve the position, the experience of disabled people who need accessible and adapted housing is that good housing experiences often happen by chance and only after years of a lack of independence or constraints in daily and family life. And these things basically amount to a denial of disabled people's human rights. So it's high time that we acted to make these experiences a thing of the past. And I hope events like this will galvanise people into action, people with different perspectives on the matter, to try and work together. Thank you very much for listening. If anyone wants to contact me at any point to discuss any of these issues, I'd be very keen to be in contact.